So, welcome to the Books and Music Show. I'm glad to have you back again on the Books and Music Show. And we have, Gerard here is going to do a fabulous show on, I believe the topic is free speech. Over to you, Gerard.
Thank you for that great introduction. Today we're going to be talking about free speech in broadly, but also specific cases of speech infringement and why this debate is so important. So in the news lately, you've heard about a lot of cases of people, speakers at different college campuses being attacked and abused or even prevented from speaking at certain campuses. What amounts to a heckler's veto. The idea of a heckler's veto is a person or usually a group of people preventing another person from speaking because they disagree with their point of view on a particular subject. So even though the government in that case isn't suppressing speech, the speech is being suppressed effectively by the actions of individuals. This is what people when people get into a discussion of censorship, a lot of people who disagree with a particular point of view, say a conservative speaker or a libertarian speaker comes to campus and they are prevented from speaking or shouted down. Or a lot of people will say that this technically isn't censorship because censorship is the government infringing on your right to speak, to peaceably assemble. Like, to give an example, during World War I, people were prevented, imprisoned for speaking out against the war. There was this huge hysteria, this huge anti-German pro-war hysteria after Woodrow Wilson decided to enter the war on the side of the Allies, and people were actually punished for speaking out against the war. People like Norman Thomas, the leader of the Socialist Party, and pacifists who disagreed with the decision, they were prosecuted and served jail sentences, some of them lengthy, because they spoke up against the war. And that's probably one of the best examples of government infringement on the First Amendment. And you've had other examples of that as well. One of the earliest was the Alien and Sedition Acts, when the government, the Federalist Party, which was in charge of the government, decided to punish critics who were they were called the Democrat Republicans, the people who were pro France and anti Great Britain, and the government decided to punish these people by curtailing their right to speak, and punishing people they saw as foreign seditious elements. And those are just two of the most prominent examples of the government suppressing free speech. But another way of stifling free speech is, as I said, the heckler's veto, using your using force of numbers, or you're or in order to intimidate or stop someone from speaking. And some people who disagree with these speakers say that this technically isn't censorship. And the problem is there's not a clear term to delineate between when the government is suppressing your speech, and when your right to speak or to assemble is being suppressed by a non-governmental group, a group of individuals or collective that's not it doesn't have the imprimatur of the government. But it's still a violation of the spirit of the First Amendment. And there are a lot of cases of this happening recently. For example, there was a professor at Evergreen State University, which is a very kind of progressive, radical campus in Washington, which has a lot of student activism. And there's a professor there named Bret Weinstein, and he's gotten a lot of publicity lately because he refused to accede to the demands of a group of college students who wanted all of the professors to stop teaching, essentially to stop, to close down their classes, because, and the reason behind this movement was because the teachers, essentially, it's hard to explain the backstory, but it was essentially because they were white. They thought that the campus was discriminating against black people and minorities and non-white students, so they wanted to shut down. They effectively wanted to shut down the campus, and Bret Weinstein refused, and he was kind of forced to leave the campus, even though he wasn't fired. He wasn't. The university itself, the faculty the administration didn't punish him. He was still forced to leave campus because of a group of radical students who refused to let a small group of students who refused to let the rest of the campus learn and attend lectures in order to make their racial political grievances predominant. So the university actually wound up settling with him later on after this incident, but the upshot is that the university lost a very competent, skilled professor because of the insistence that a small group of radical students be satisfied, even if it was to the detriment of the rest of the student body. And it's not just the faculty and the students on campus who are suffering. I think the broader body politic is suffering, since these students are graduating into a world where they have to grapple with different political perspectives, and they're not really being given an opportunity to engage in debate. Now, there are some people, like there's a professor in Canada at a Canadian university who said that this is a mischaracterization of what's happening. That the college environment is supposed to be a cocoon where people aren't challenged repeatedly by political philosophies and points of view that contradict what they believe, that it's supposed to be an isolated kind of oasis, which is a puzzling way of describing college. When you think of what a traditional liberal arts education is supposed to be, it's predicated to a certain extent on immersing yourself in different points of view, not just like classical philosophy and historical perspectives, but also beliefs that challenge, what you might that challenge your preconceptions. I mean, and when you prevent people from teaching or teaching anything that might contradict what a student believes, you're kind of interrupting learning. But even more so, you're kind of diminishing the potency of the First Amendment. Like it's sort of what undergirds our society. The ability to speak and to assemble and speak freely and debate. And when you have people who can't talk, basically, because a group of radicals who prevent them from speaking, you're undermining the foundation of the country. And there's a great interview of a Peruvian writer, Mario Vargas Llosa, who speaks about this topic. Even though he's not from the United States, he has a lot of insight into the radicalization of students and how that has a wider impact upon society. So the interview was conducted with El País, which is a Spanish newspaper, a very popular Spanish newspaper, but it was translated into English, and he's discussing his own life as a student and how he was a radical. He was kind of a Marxist. And he says, I started at the National University of San Marcos with the idea that there would be communists I could mix with. But the communism in Latin America was pure Stalinism with parties subject to the Comintern in Moscow. I was only militant for a year. And then he goes on to describe his evolution, his political evolution. How he went to Cuba and he criticized the Castro regime and questioned Fidel Castro and what he was doing to the country. Putting people in the equivalent of concentration camps or gulags for their political opinions, and he describes how this worked, how all these events kind of altered his political thinking. And later on in the interview, he goes on to describe. He talks about this. He makes the connection between the student ferment and what you're seeing on college campuses today. And I think there really is a certain connection when you look at events in the United States and the tumult that you saw in the 1960s, not just in the United States, but also in places like Paris and France, where you had students taking over faculty buildings and just sometimes even rioting in order to affect their demands for more control over the university curriculum and what's taught in universities, and conversely what isn't taught. So a lot of the things that are excluded from universities are, a lot of the ideas are excluded because of the demands of students. For example, in Stanford University, there were protests against the Western Civ curriculum, and as a result, they basically jettisoned the Western civilization curriculum. Large parts of it study of Shakespeare and other classical European authors. And this was in 1992, almost two and a half decades ago. So it's not. This isn't a recent phenomenon. This is just kind of a crystallization of something that's been happening for years, and it's probably come about now because of come about because of the political environment, the fact that there's a backlash against the liberal political ideas. So you see on college campuses kind of a counter reaction. Kind of a counter reaction by students who are used to being cocooned in this sort of environment where their ideas aren't really challenged, and you can see what happens when this is really when this sort of phenomenon isn't really challenged. You don't necessarily descend into totalitarianism, but you have this sort of slippery slope where these actions are condoned, and then it escalates to the point where you have people being physically assaulted for expressing their views. For example, when Charles Murray went to Middlebury University to speak, they couldn't actually have the discussion in an auditorium or a venue where students could see him. They had to tape a discussion between him and one of the professor who invited him and show it via remote link. They had to upload it to the internet, and the students were able to watch it that way, but they couldn't hold it in an auditorium because it would have been disrupted, and even so, even though they took precautions to prevent any sort of violence, he and the professor were still assaulted, and the professor was sent to the hospital for a concussion when they left the when they left the building where they were filming this, recording this interview. So you have people who were physically assaulting professors and writers and political activists because of their point of view, which is this sort of environment that is really ripe for authoritarianism and just this sort of dystopian political outcome where people don't resolve their differences through debate or through elections or any sort of non-authoritarian vehicle where they just resolve it through violence and physical coercion. And it's not. And I think the problem is actually getting worse when you look at surveys of college students in particular. Their attitudes about whether or not free speech should be criminalized are very, very troubling, because a lot of them actually do want to penalize people for speech that they consider hate speech, or even though the idea of hate speech isn't really specified, they want to punish people for speech that they deem to be hate speech, or even not necessarily hate speech, but speech that they oppose. So you have people who are of voting age and who are graduating into a world of where this is the norm on college campuses, and the idea that some people hold that you could contain it simply to college campuses is kind of absurd when you think about the influence that these students are going to have once they graduate and take these ideas with them into the wider world. So I mean I'm not sure exactly where this is headed. A lot of there are groups of people who are trying to roll back this tide of, for lack of a better word, censorship. There's a group called the Foundation for Individual Rights and in Education, which is a free speech group that's been fighting these sorts of encroachments on speech since the early 90s, and they regularly fight against so-called or what are called speech codes, which are essentially restrictions on when and where you can speak within a college campus. Now, there are a lot of there's a distinction between private and public universities, and the fact that if you're at a public university, the administration really has no right to restrict what you say or when you say it beyond disruptive speech. In other words, trying to prevent classes, trying to prevent professors from teaching. But the problem is a lot of the suppression of speech isn't happening simply because of the administration or at the behest of the administration. It's happening because the students are driving driving this campaign. They're the ones, the students, and in some cases people off campus who aren't students, who are attacking and trying to deny people their right, their free speech rights. So while groups like FIRE are successful to a certain degree in fighting back university speech codes and speech restrictions that are imposed by the administration of these colleges and universities, it's hard to fight back against students who are actively trying to stifle free speech and to create this sort of homogenous, politically monolithic culture on their campuses.
4 minutes.
It's hard to fight against a majority, or even if it's not a majority, a very vocal and aggressive minority who are intent on not listening to any sort of contrary opinions. So I think it's going to be difficult to fight this sort of grassroots movement, but on a positive note, I think the fact that people like Brett Weinstein and some other professors, the professor at NYU who is resisting this movement and has written about it on his own website and used social media to fight back against the anti-speech crusaders. I think the fact that these people are becoming more prominent because of social media and the internet, and having their voices shared with not just their students, but people outside of the campus, the university environment. The fact that this message is being disseminated so widely is positive, and I think it's a good thing in the long run to make people aware of what's happening on college campuses, particularly parents who are making these important decisions about where in concert with their children, about where they want to go to college. And I think this is one of the main reasons why someone should think critically about where they want to what university or college they want to attend, because if the college that you're attending doesn't respect the basic idea of the First Amendment, they don't really have a good idea of what the mission of the university is. So just to wrap things up, I think people should be more involved in this issue at a kind of a grassroots level, and just get more information and try to understand the issues and understand why the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights is so important, and why the preservation is dependent to a large degree on on people who are in colleges right now, who are, young people. So that's just my opinion. You can do it for yourselves, and we'll be joining you soon.